He was known as the Tomato Killer for his tendency to target red-headed women. He had eyes that could keep one awake at night. His name was Joseph Medley, a long-forgotten serial killer who killed at least 3 women during the mid-1940s. After the killing of his last victim in 1946, he was tracked down in St. Louis. Despite a brief escape from prison, wherein he almost eluded police by hiding in a sewer pipe, he was apprehended and ultimately executed on December 20th, 1946. My focus will not be so much covering all of the crimes of Joseph Medley, or even focusing on Medley himself, but rather honing in on what was arguably his most forgotten murder. This is the La Pavilion Hotel at the corner of Poydras and Baronne Streets in New Orleans, Louisiana. Opening in 1907, this always posh location, back in 1944, was known as the De Soto. Christmas was right around the corner that year, and only days before then, a Mr. and Mrs. D.J. Stafford checked in at this hotel. After staying there briefly, Mr. Stafford approached the front desk on December 22nd and asked that they not disturb the room until after December 24th, as he and his wife would be away for a Christmas celebration during that time. Despite being told this, and the Do Not Disturb sign being up on the door, a maid decided to enter the room. It was clean and quiet, until the maid reached the bathroom. There, she discovered the nude body of a young red-headed woman laying in the bathtub in about 6 inches of water. It was difficult to ascertain the exact circumstances of her death. While briefly considered to be a suicide, it was determined she died as a result of suffocation while submerged underwater. But when her lungs were checked, it was deemed they did not have enough water in them to justify this was a simple drowning. This was a homicide. While the woman was yet to be identified, she had an interesting mix of items with her, including a ring with the engraving LF and $360 in cash sewn into her underwear. These intriguing circumstances only expanded when the FBI was brought in to take fingerprints in order to identify the woman. Her name was Laura Fischer. Originally from Austria, she came to America in 1940 under the Alien Registration Act. This act, passed in June of 1940, was established primarily to keep radicals and, more importantly, communists from entering America. This led to Fisher often being referred to as the enemy alien or alien beauty in newspapers. Her reported address at the time of her death was in Manhattan, New York. One newspaper reported that she had a job as a textile worker there. It's unknown the circumstances that led her all the way to New Orleans, or how she ended up with this mysterious D.J. Stafford. That became the next focus in the matter, as this man conveniently disappeared from the hotel and never returned, leaving a dead woman behind. This man said he was from Chicago, but a check revealed his address there did not exist. And that was it for a time. Stafford disappeared, and nobody locally knew who he was. Then, just under 2 months later, something very interesting happened. In Chicago, of all places, a maid entered a hotel room with its Do Not Disturb sign up and discovered 38-year-old Blanche Zimmerman, a redhead, dead in the bathtub in about 6 inches of water. It didn't take long for the correlations between this case and Laura Fischer's case to be established. When the investigation into this Chicago murder began, authorities found several witnesses who identified Joseph Medley as the man who'd been seen at the hotel with Zimmerman. And such is how we entered the New Orleans case. As a man whose MO was leaving his victims in bathtubs, I briefly wondered, granted on a whim, if he may have been responsible, as a man who seemed to travel a lot, for the still unsolved murder of Georgette Bauerdorf in Los Angeles on October 12, 1944, just a little over 2 months before Laura Fischer was killed. Bauerdorf was found beaten and strangled to death in her bathtub. It seemed enticing, until I noted that Joseph Medley had been in prison until late November 1944, when he managed to escape. A couple months later, March 6, 1945, a Washington, D.C. woman, Nancy Boyer, also a redhead, had been throwing a long poker game, which Medley attended. After everyone left, it appears he returned to the Boyer home, where he shot her to death in her kitchen before ransacking the home. When Medley was later tracked down in St. Louis, he had Boyer's fur coat in his possession. As far as Medley's killings were concerned, Boyer was the one that got the most attention, and it was the only case he would be tried and ultimately executed for. There's little doubt that he was responsible for the Fischer and Zimmerman murders, as more witnesses came forward over time identifying Medley as being at both scenes. And later, a newspaper boy would even recount a man who looked exactly like Joseph Medley, getting a paper from him because he wanted to see the latest on the bathtub murder. New Orleans authorities had hopes that Medley would be sent to them, as they had stricter punishments for murder, and most certainly would have condemned him to death on a guilty verdict. Orleans Parish indicted him on March 1, 1945, only 5 days before Nancy Boyer would be killed. But Medley would never come back to New Orleans. It seems at the time it was a given that he had killed Boyer, while there was still some lingering doubt at the time as to whether Fischer and Zimmerman were even murders in the first place. So despite New Orleans indicting him first, when Medley was captured, he was taken back to D.C. to be tried for that crime. Today, even with Joseph Medley being a fairly obscure killer, Laura Fischer is an even more obscure murder victim whose case is seldom ever mentioned without the immediate mention of Joseph Medley as well. And because he was never tried for her murder, it leaves a lot of questions open, such as how they met one another in the first place. Seeing as Medley was known to travel around a lot after his prison break, he most certainly could have made his way to New York. But still, the odds of him finding Laura Fischer in such a massive city? And what were the circumstances that landed them both in New Orleans? Did they meet there instead of New York? The fact that Laura willingly identified herself as his husband when they checked in at the DeSoto is worth noting as well. Had he swept her off her feet maybe, leading her to believe she had found a better life with a good man, only to wind up dead in 6 inches of water? It's hard to know, with what little is known about Medley's experiences with both Fischer and Zimmerman, but it was reported that he'd been dating Nancy Boyer leading up to her murder. So that may have been his MO, to woo women before killing them. But robbery was also thought to be a key element of the Boyer murder, as she had many valuable possessions that Medley took. And while there's little to suggest that Laura, the textile worker, had much to be killed for, she did have the equivalency of nearly $6,000 today hidden in her underwear when she was killed. Maybe by 1944, she was more well-to-do than one might expect, which may have enticed Joseph Medley when they met. Despite numerous witnesses putting him in New Orleans at this time, the argument has been made that Medley could only be deemed as a person of interest in this case. One newspaper even went so far as to say that the Zimmerman murder was really just an accident. It is fair to note that eyewitness accounts can be wrong, and the killing of Nancy Boyer was substantially different than these previous cases. But still, most people, myself included, believe that Joseph Medley was Laura Fischer's killer. While at least one picture of Blanche Zimmerman and Nancy Boyer have been readily available, I've never found a picture of Laura Fischer. Online, in newspapers, anywhere. Which I feel serves as a strong metaphor for how forgotten her case was. And it was a brutal death. I can't imagine many worse ways to go than to be held underwater, suffocating, and not being able to escape. It's also a very tragic way to go for someone who came to America from a foreign land, way back when coming to America was to achieve the dream in life. When we think of brutal murders at the hands of serial offenders, we think of them as happening in dark places, run-down buildings in blighted parts of town, especially when they're older cases, such as this one. We don't think of majestic hotels like this as a likely site for homicidal violence. But that's just what happened here back in December 1944.